Would you believe that a dog managed to stop a bus from leaving, and with that, prevented a tragedy that no one imagined? This true story took place in the United States, and perhaps you have never stopped to think how an animal's sensitivity and instinct can see what human eyes often miss. Imagine the scene. A busy terminal, distracted passengers, each immersed in their routine, and a simple detail that could turn that day into an episode of pain and loss. But against all odds, a dog put himself between danger and people, as if he knew exactly what was at stake. Have you ever been through this? That moment when it seems that just one detail can completely change the course of history. This is where this narrative begins to gain traction. What is most striking in this case is not only the mechanical failure that could have caused serious consequences, but the fact that a dog was the only one to notice that something was wrong. While passengers were talking, the driver was preparing to start and everything seemed to go on as normal. That dog remained restless, attentive to every detail, as if it had captured an invisible message for everyone else. What you will discover now may surprise you. It is not always humans who save animals. Often they are the ones who save us. The scene was seemingly ordinary, but as you know, it is precisely in everyday life that the unexpected can happen. No one there expected that a bus would carry with it such a great risk. No one imagined that an unnoticed detail could put so many lives in danger. However, for this dog, nothing seemed normal. His behavior began to attract attention, first unobtrusively, then in a way that is impossible to ignore. Insistent barking, firm movements, as if he wanted at any cost to prevent the vehicle from leaving. Have you ever felt that strange feeling that something wasn't right, even without being able to explain why? This is exactly what this dog experienced. But unlike many of us, he did not sit still. He acted. This act of courage and instinct makes us reflect on how animals have a perception that goes beyond the obvious. How many times have we heard stories of dogs that have warned their owners about fires, earthquakes, or even health problems before any obvious sign? And yet each new story manages to thrill us as if it were the first. Perhaps because deep down these episodes remind us of something essential. We are not as alone as we think. There is always someone, albeit a four-legged one, willing to protect us in ways we can't foresee. It stays with me until the end, because what this dog did on that terminal goes far beyond a simple bark. Now imagine the racing heart of the driver, who at that instant had no idea of the danger he was about to face. Imagine the passengers, some in a hurry, others distracted, not realizing they were seconds away from becoming part of an accident. And in the midst of it all, that persistent dog, who seemed to be fighting against time, against indifference, against logic that would say that an animal could not stop an entire bus. With every bark, with every forward movement, he seemed to shout a clear message: "Stop! Something is wrong." And it was precisely this silent cry, translated into courage and determination, that changed the course of that morning. This is not just a story about an animal and a vehicle. It's a story about instinct, about invisible connection, and about how attention can save lives. And maybe it's also an invitation to think about how much we ignore signs that are right in front of us. Because on that day, a dog became a hero without needing medals, without speeches, only with his courage and his insistence on being heard. And it is at this point in the story that everything begins to take on an even more surprising outline. And while this scene unfolded in front of so many people who would only later understand the gravity of the situation, an inevitable feeling arises in those who listen to this story. How is it possible that a dog was the only one to perceive the danger? Perhaps it is precisely this capacity of instinct, so pure and so true, that makes us rethink how attentive we are, or distracted, before the signs that life gives us. And this is where I want to make room for you too. If this topic makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what touched you the most in this story so far. It can be a memory with your own dog, an experience when you felt this invisible instinct, or simply your opinion about how special these animals are. When you comment, in addition to sharing your vision, you also help keep this conversation alive, making other people find this content and reflect along with us. It's like creating a chain of stories and feelings that connect to each other. And since we're talking about connection, take the opportunity to leave your like. This simple gesture shows that this type of narrative really touches you and encourages us to continue bringing stories that inspire. And of course, if you feel that more content like this is worth following, subscribe to the channel. Your participation here is what makes this space grow and reach more people with this type of message. Each inscription is like a reminder that there is a community gathered around something greater, the power of real stories that excite and awaken in us a new way of looking at the world and the animals that walk by our side. Because after all, when we share feelings and experiences, we stop being just spectators and become an active part of this journey. And this story of the hero dog still has details that will make you think even more about what courage and unconditional love really mean. The terminal was busy that morning. People came and went in a hurry, carrying backpacks, bags, conversations interrupted by the constant noise of engines and horns. It was one of those common scenarios of big cities, in which everyone seems immersed in their own thoughts, too busy with their routines to notice details around. But in the midst of all that rush, there was a presence that stood out from the urban scene. A medium-sized dog, brown coat mixed with white, attentive gaze and serene posture, as if it had a silent purpose in that place. It wasn't the first time passengers had seen that dog over there. Many even already knew him by sight, because he circled almost every day in the same space, following a simple routine and, at the same time, full of meaning. This dog lived in a small house near the terminal, with a family that treated him as an essential part of the home. He was not just a pet. He was a walking companion, keeper of small secrets of the neighborhood children, and a constant presence that conveyed security. Whenever the family headed to the bus stop, he accompanied them to a certain stretch, as if to make sure they were okay. Over time, his figure became familiar also to drivers, collectors, and passengers. There were those who greeted him with an affectionate gesture, those who offered him a piece of bread, or even those who said that that dog had something different in its look. And indeed, there was. It was as if he carried a sharp sensitivity, a constant attention to what was happening around. While other dogs could be easily distracted, he seemed to observe the movement with attentive eyes, as if recording every detail. Maybe that's why I created a kind of silent bond with that public space. For many, it was just a dog on the sidewalk, but for him, that place was part of his routine, an extension of his home, a lookout point where he followed the comings and goings of people and vehicles. On that particular day, something seemed different. Passengers, distracted by conversations or immersed in their cell phones, did not notice anything out of the ordinary, but the dog felt it. He would stop in front of the bus, stare at the vehicle, and then pace back and forth as if seeking to comprehend what was about to happen. It was unusual behavior, even more so for someone who was already used to seeing him just watching in silence. There was a restlessness in the air, an energy that to human eyes went unnoticed, but which to him was impossible to ignore. This behavior makes us reflect on how animals are able to pick up invisible signals, which we often do not understand. They perceive vibrations, smells, subtle changes in the environment that to us seem irrelevant. How many stories have we heard of dogs that sense earthquakes, that identify health crises in their owners, or that sense risky situations? What impresses is not only the instinct, but the decision to act on that instinct. Because feeling is one thing, but having the courage to put yourself in motion is quite another. The dog's family had already noticed on several occasions how protectively he behaved. Once, when one of the children almost crossed the street without looking to the sides, he rushed forward, stopping the hurried step with a sharp movement. Another time, in the face of an aggressively approaching stranger, he positioned himself as a shield, showing that he would not allow any threat. These episodes, which might seem small, have been creating an image of trust in the hearts of everyone around. He wasn't just a dog, he was a guardian, and it's curious to think how, behind the scenes of our own journeys, we often also need someone to help us see what we can't see on our own. It can be a friend who realizes a mistake we were about to make, a mentor who points out a different path, or even an unexpected situation that forces us to rethink decisions. This dog unknowingly represented exactly that to those people. The figure who sees the hidden truth before the impact is realized. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when we look at his routine, we see more than just walks around the neighborhood. We see a mindset shaped by constant observation, a sense of belonging, and the courage to make quick decisions. There is something transformative about noticing how a being who does not speak our language manages to convey such clear messages through attitudes. He teaches us that it is not about words, but about presence. It's not about explanations, but about actions, and it completely changes the way we interpret not only his story, but also our own. This invisible connection between the dog and the people around it was not the result of chance. It was the fruit of coexistence, of trust built day after day, of shared experiences that created a link impossible to ignore. And perhaps this is one of the greatest impacts that animals have on our lives, the ability to create authentic bonds, free of masks and filters, based only on the truth that they carry in their instincts. When we think about personal transformation, how often do we need to relearn just that, to trust what we feel more than what logic insists on telling us? As we look at this dog, we can see a metaphor for our own journey. How often do we ignore signs that could prevent pain and tragedy in our lives? How many times do we move on, stuck in our routines, not paying attention to small alerts that could change everything? The difference is that while we often hesitated, he did not hesitate. He decided to act. And it's at this point that the story gains even more traction, because we're not just talking about an animal, but a profound truth about courage, mindfulness, and the way we choose to respond to circumstances that come our way. It is inevitable to realize that in the midst of urban chaos, this dog carried with it a kind of silent consciousness. He was like an attentive observer, an unobtrusive guardian ready to intervene at the right moment. It didn't matter if the passengers ignored him, if people didn't understand his movements. He knew there was something there that couldn't be overlooked, and this firm, almost obstinate stance revealed more about our own humanity than we realized. Because if he was able to perceive a risk and take action, what does that say about our responsibility to also be attentive to the signs of life? Maybe that's why stories like this touch us so deeply. They speak not just of a heroic dog, but of our need to rescue mindfulness, to see beyond the distractions that surround us every day. And if we think about it, isn't that what defines moments of true transformation? Those moments when we could see what was invisible and, from there, make different decisions? The dog in that terminal was the living symbol of that possibility. And that's just the first layer of what happened that day. Because what seemed just another ordinary morning at the terminal hid behind the scenes of tension, unexpected revelations, and an impact that no one could have predicted. Every detail of this scene leads us to reflect not only on animal heroism, but also on our own ability to perceive, act, and change the course of what seems inevitable. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." The driver was already ready to put the bus in motion. He adjusted the rearview mirrors with the naturalness of someone who repeated that gesture dozens of times a day. His movements were sure, almost automatic, as if every adjustment was already recorded in memory. Meanwhile, passengers occupied their seats distracted, some fiddling with their cell phones, others looking out the window with that lost look of those who think about work, school, or the commitments that awaited them. Some whispered quick conversations, while others seemed to carry the weight of the silent haste of those who just wanted to get to the destination right away. The environment seemed normal, routine, almost banal, but there was one barely noticeable detail that turned that routine into something potentially tragic. The side door of the vehicle had not closed properly, leaving a small opening. To any inattentive eye, it could seem insignificant, just another common adjustment that resolves on the way. But on that day, this detail hid a real danger. That failure wasn't just mechanical, it was an invisible trap, a risk calculated in seconds, ready to reveal itself in brutal fashion. As passengers accommodated bags and backpacks, some standing near the door, the faulty mechanism vibrated with each movement of the still-stopped bus. With each swing of the body, that small space opened and closed, like a trap about to be set. It would be enough for the driver to accelerate, so that a person could be pulled, pressed, or even thrown. It wasn't just a technical glitch, it was a silent threat about to materialize in seconds. The dog, however, seemed to feel each vibration as if it were a thunderous alert. He did not tear his eyes away from the bus, restless, taking short steps from one side to the other, barking insistently, as if each bark was a desperate warning that something terrible was about to happen. Suspense was in the air, invisible to everyone except him. Imagine an invisible clock counting down the seconds to an accident and no one there noticing. The driver was already checking the mirrors, ready to start, confident that everything was right. The noise of the engine covered up any extraneous noise, and the haste of the passengers covered up any chance of reflection. And only that dog, who had no instruction manual or mechanical knowledge, grasped the gravity of the situation. He had no way to explain it in words, but his language was clear. The barking, the erect body, the firm posture, everything about him screamed that something was wrong. And here comes a profound point. How many times in our own journey do we ignore the little signs that life gives us? A strange sensation, a detail that does not fit, a hidden truth that insists on appearing but that we choose to ignore out of haste or convenience. How many times do we keep going, trusting that nothing serious will happen until life proves us otherwise? What was happening at that terminal was more than a mechanical failure. It was a living metaphor for the importance of attention, of the courage to stop before the consequences become irreversible. Every second mattered. The driver was already touching the gear shift, his hand steady, ready to go. It was at this moment that the dog made a decision. Not only did he bark louder, but he placed himself right in front of the vehicle, as if he was willing to face a ton machine to stop it from moving forward. The scene is almost cinematic. The contrast between a seemingly small animal in front of an iron giant, between pure instinct and the cold logic of haste. There was something transformative in that instant, an impact that only those who witnessed it could feel. Some passengers finally began to notice the commotion. A gray-haired lady turned her face to the window and frowned, as if trying to understand this insistent behavior. A young man, headphones hanging around his neck, shook his head annoyed, muttering something like, "What a boring dog." Another passenger tried to startle him with gestures, not imagining that he was, in fact, saving each of them. This is another telling aspect. Often when someone tries to warn us of a danger, our first reaction is one of irritation or disbelief. We prefer to keep the comfortable narrative that everything is fine, that nothing is going to happen, until reality insists on showing us otherwise. But the dog did not give up. He jumped, ran from side to side, returned to the front of the bus, as if time were his most cruel enemy. And it was, because every second of delay could mean the difference between lives preserved and a disaster. This obstinate behavior shows that courage is not always accompanied by physical strength. It is often the unwavering determination, the commitment to what feels true, that turns an instant into something heroic. Now I want to go even deeper into this issue, because what was at stake, there was not only the safety of passengers, but the collective mentality that makes us, so often, ignore danger signals. Think about the decisions we make daily, without reflecting, just trusting that it will work out. How many times do we move on without noticing that a cog is not in place, that a relationship is fraying, that a project has structural flaws? This rush to live in the automatic can lead us to serious consequences, just as it would have led those passengers if it were not for the intervention of the dog. The suspense of that scene is the same that we feel when life puts us at a crossroads. The detail may seem small, but the impact is immense. The driver was not aware of the fault. The passengers were not aware of the risk. But someone outside the ordinary logic saw the truth. This shows us that often the revelation does not come from the expected, but from where we least imagine. And this is the most powerful frame of this story. The realization that even in everyday situations, what we ignore can turn into our greatest danger. This frozen moment between the engine about to start and the dog blocking the way is a reminder that courage is not measured by the greatness of the gesture, but by the decision not to be silent in the face of what matters. And if we think about it, we've all been in similar situations where we felt something was wrong but chose to go anyway. This dog teaches us that when the hidden truth appears before us, the wisest attitude is to stop, observe, and decide differently. What makes this scene so impactful is precisely the tension of every second. It was like watching a movie in slow motion, in which the audience already knows that something is about to happen, but the characters are not yet. Only here it was not about fiction, but about real lives. And in this unexpected theater, the protagonist was an animal who did not ask for applause, but only trusted his instinct. And it is at this point that we need to reflect. Are there not badly closed doors in our own lives that carry invisible dangers, seemingly small situations that can generate gigantic impacts? That bus represented more than a vehicle. It symbolized human haste, the habit of ignoring signals, the blind confidence that everything will be fine. And the dog, on the other hand, represented the call to attention, the need to look deeper, to see what is before us before it is too late. He says, "I'm on this journey too." He was there, standing in front of the bus as if it were the last barrier between people and danger. His eyes shone with alertness, his ears always raised, picking up every sound, every vibration that spread through the environment. While everyone around him was immersed in distractions, the dog seemed tuned to a different frequency, able to decipher what humans couldn't. There was something wrong, something invisible to human eyes but impossible to ignore for his keen instinct. And then he began to bark, without stopping, with a more serious tone, almost desperate, as if his voice was the only weapon he had to awaken those people from indifference. Barking echoed through the terminal, mingling with the clatter of engines, hurried footsteps, and cut-off conversations. Some glances turned towards him, but most reacted with the impatience typical of those who do not understand the message. It was as if the dog was trying to translate a hidden truth that insisted on revealing itself, but which no one was yet willing to hear. With each bark, his posture became firmer, and his body vibrated with the urgency of one who knows he can't wait. This insistence was not just noise. It was the cry of a guardian who understood the impact that would come if he did not act. And here something fundamental comes in. Often in our journey we are surrounded by signs that repeat themselves, but we choose to ignore. Small internal voices that tell us be careful, but that we silence to maintain haste or the illusion of control. This dog, at that moment, was the living embodiment of how intuition, when ignored, insists on becoming louder and louder until it becomes impossible not to hear. Passengers began to bother. Some muttered among themselves, wondering why that dog wouldn't stop barking. Others chased him away with gestures, as if they wanted to expel not only the animal, but also the message it carried. And this is telling. The first reaction to an alert is often rejection, because accepting the warning means facing that there is a danger, and admitting it can be uncomfortable. The human being tends to avoid what breaks his bubble of normality, while the dog, guided by instinct, did not allow himself to ignore what he felt. The intensity of the barking increased. He not only vocalized, but used his body as a message. He advanced a few steps, retreated, positioned himself in the path of the front wheel, as if he wanted to make it clear that he would not allow the bus to follow. And it is in this contrast between human logic and animal sensibility that the most powerful part of this scene arises. While human eyes saw only a noisy dog, the heart of that animal knew that it was facing a life or death decision. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what this dog represents goes beyond the episode itself. The instinct that moved it is the same one that in our lives we call intuition, perception, or sixth sense. How many times have we felt that cold in the belly that prevents us from making a certain decision, or that inner voice that advises us to wait a little longer before moving forward? And yet, how many times do we prefer to ignore this feeling, following only what seems logical, until we discover too late the price of choice? What was happening there was a living reminder that intuition can be the fine line between safety and disaster. This dog did not have any technical information, did not know the behind-the-scenes mechanics, did not know about gears or safety systems, but he knew clearly and absolutely that something was wrong. This shows us that we don't always have to have all the answers to recognize a danger. Sometimes it is enough to pay attention to what we feel, to what vibrates inside us when the environment is not in harmony. This sensitivity, which in the animal translates into barking and firm gestures, in US manifests itself in insistent thoughts, forebodings or signals that seem small, but that carry a great impact. As the barks echoed, the driver hesitated. He already had his hand on the change, but the insistent presence of that dog began to arouse in him a doubt. It was as if the animal was trying at all costs to stop a decision that could change everything. And this detail is profound. Often, before an error or an accident, there is a brief pause, an instant in which something makes us think, should I really? It is in this small space of hesitation that the greatest transformations happen, because there is the chance to decide differently. The unwitting audience, the passengers, were now divided between irritation and curiosity. Some wanted the driver to simply ignore the dog and drive off. Others began to wonder if there was anything to justify such insistent behavior. The truth is that deep down everyone knew that it was out of the ordinary. After all, a dog does not put itself at risk for nothing. But to recognize this required one more step, to abandon the rush and really look at the scene before them. That's the big lesson hidden in the narrative. When we ignore signs, it's usually because we don't want to deal with the revelation they bring. But the more we try to silence the voice of intuition, the louder it screams. And in that terminal, the barking was already so insistent that no one could pretend not to hear it. It was the materialization of something everyone, on some level, has experienced. That nagging sensation that insists on telling us that the path we're about to take may not be safe. And if we stop to reflect, we realize that this is not exclusive to animals. How often do we ignore the little signs in our relationships, in our jobs, in our personal choices? The door that does not close well, the look that does not convey confidence, the detail that does not fit. All these are invisible barks that try to protect us. But like the passengers on that bus, we often prefer to be bothered by the alert than to stop to hear its message. The dog, however, had no such choice. For him, ignoring would be impossible. His whole body was a reflection of instinct, and every fiber of his being seemed to scream in unison, "Something will happen, and I cannot allow it." That sense of responsibility, that courage to put themselves at risk, just to protect lives they didn't even understand what was at stake, is what makes this scene so powerful. It is the revelation that, at crucial moments, it is not size or strength that defines impact, but the willingness to act. And as the tension grew, the scenario turned into a stage of suspense. The dog on one side, firm in his purpose, the driver of the other, hesitating between haste and doubt, and in between dozens of lives about to be affected by a decision that would resolve itself in seconds. It was as if time had slowed down, as if every heartbeat echoed in the air. All that remained was the choice: go ahead ignoring the warning, or stop to listen to the message. He said, "That makes sense to me." The driver took a deep breath, adjusted the mirrors, and turned the key in the ignition with the tranquility of someone who repeated that ritual every day. To him, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The noise of passengers straightening backpacks, the clink of the collector's coins, the creak of the doors, all sounded familiar. In that ordinary scenario, the dog barking outside was just another annoying detail, a background element in the noisy landscape of the terminal. He had no idea that, in that instant, the difference between normalcy and tragedy depended on exactly what he was about to ignore. The passengers, too busy in their own worlds, did not pay the slightest attention either. A young man in headphones drummed his fingers on his knee, immersed in his music. A lady fumbled in her bag, looking for something in a hurry. Two teenagers exchanged low laughter, as if oblivious to everything around. For them, the dog was just another noise, an urban nuisance that did not deserve importance. Some even laughed, others grumbled, and there were those who shook their heads in disapproval, as if silently saying, "Someone get this animal out of here." But the dog was not barking on a whim. His entire body was on alert, vibrating with the invisible tension he seemed to feel in the air. The ears pointed forward, the eyes fixed on the bus, the muscles contracted like stretched strings about to break. He didn't need to understand mechanics to know something was wrong. To him, it wasn't just another vehicle about to leave. It was a living threat, an iron giant about to move, carrying with it a risk no one else realized. Their barking grew louder, more constant, reverberating through space like hammering against the wall of human indifference. But the truth is that when a warning comes from where we do not expect it, the tendency is almost always to reject it. Passengers interpreted that sound as noise, not a signal. Blindness to the obvious manifested itself in every impatient look, in every sigh of irritation. And this isn't just about that scene, it's about us. How often do we get warnings from people, from situations, even from our own bodies, and choose to ignore them? How many times do we move on because it is more comfortable to believe that everything is fine, even when intuition screams otherwise? The dog, realizing that just barking was not enough, made a radical decision. He advanced to the front of the bus and stood there, firm, as if his presence were an insurmountable barrier. It was as if he said with his body and with his eyes, "You will not go forward until I am heard." The scene had something heroic and, at the same time, desperate, because there was no logic that justified the courage of that gesture, only the silent conviction that it was necessary. The driver, annoyed, frowned. He pressed the horn, and the shrill sound spread through the terminal. The noise echoed as a warning to the contrary, but the dog did not move. On the contrary, it barked even harder. The hair stood on end, the breath panting. It was a silent duel. On the one hand, human haste; on the other, animal intuition. On the one hand, the logic of routine; on the other, the pure instinct that did not need proof to manifest itself. And this scene carries a powerful symbolism. In life, how many times do we need to take the posture of this dog? How many times do we have to put ourselves as a barrier in front of something that threatens to go in the wrong direction? To be the voice that interrupts, that bothers, that displeases even at the risk of being rejected. This is the essence of courage. It is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand firm in spite of it. The dog did not know if he would be understood. Most likely it was kicked out, ignored, even injured. But none of that mattered. He held his ground because he knew in a visceral way that the danger was real. It's exactly this kind of mindset that turns ordinary situations into transformational narratives. It is the kind of courage that, at crucial moments, defines whether we move on to disaster or whether we stop in time to change everything. Inside the bus, passengers reacted in different ways. Some urged the driver to ignore it and move on. Others, more attentive, began to wonder why a dog would make so much noise for no reason. Doubt slowly began to seep into the environment. It was like a crack in the concrete of indifference. The animal's insistence was having an effect. People, however reluctantly, were beginning to consider the possibility that there was something behind that behavior. And that's telling. Persistence in upholding the truth, even in the face of rejection, sooner or later opens the way. Conviction, when it is genuine, breaks down barriers. The dog was alone against everyone, but his insistence began to turn irritation into doubt, doubt into curiosity, and curiosity into attention. This is the cycle of impact. First you disturb, then you awaken, and finally you transform. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what we see here is not just a dog trying to stop a bus. It is the living representation of how often the warning voices appear in our lives disguised as nuisance. They don't always come as well-formulated advice, but as insistent signals that seem to disrupt the flow of routine. It can be a pain that recurs in the body, a detail that does not fit into a project, a strange feeling in a relationship. We may even want to drown out these signals, but they remain there like persistent barking until we finally decide to listen. The driver, already impatient, tried to move a few centimeters forward. The bus shuddered, the engine roared, and the dog jumped up, putting its front paws against the bumper, as if it wanted to support the weight of that machine on its own. The contrast was brutal. On one side, tons of metal and human haste. On the other, a body of just over 30 kilograms moved by sheer determination. The scene seemed impossible, but the emotional impact was undeniable. Anyone who looked closely would realize that this was not just a noisy animal. It was someone willing to risk everything to protect lives they didn't even know were in danger. And how often in our own journey are we not called to be just that? To put ourselves ahead of situations that no one else sees, to pay the price of incomprehension just because we feel we can't let something go. It is a lonely, ungrateful position, often marked by the judgment of others. But it is also the position where the greatest transformations take place. Inside the bus, an uncomfortable silence began to set in. Easy laughter gave way to serious looks. Irritation turned to caution. The dog, with its stubbornness, had changed the mood. It was no longer just a nuisance, it was a mystery that demanded an answer. And this is exactly what happens when the truth insists on showing itself. At first it bothers, then it forces attention. That moment, between horns, barking, and tense looks, was more than an urban scene. It was a portrait of the struggle between routine and intuition, between haste and attention, between blindness and perception. And in the midst of this clash, a dog stood up as a symbol of courage, showing that even alone it is possible to change the course of an entire story. He said, "That makes sense to me." The dog was no longer just barking or circling nervously around the bus. From that moment on, he made the decision that would mark the scene forever. He ran towards the front of the vehicle and positioned himself exactly halfway, right in front of the wheels that were about to turn. There was no hesitation in his movements. It was as if he had understood in fractions of a second that that would be the only way to stop the tragedy. The engine rumbled loudly, the passengers pressed for the trip to start, and the driver, increasingly impatient, did not want to waste time. But in front of him was a dog that seemed willing to risk everything to be heard. The sound of the horn cut through the air like thunder, echoing through the terminal. The driver, in an attempt to scare the animal away, kept his hand firmly on the steering wheel and his gaze fixed forward, believing that it would be enough to scare the dog to retreat. Only that's not what happened. On the contrary, the dog firmed its paws even more against the ground, facing that iron giant with the courage of one who had nothing to lose. The contrast was almost cinematic. A small body, fragile in appearance, defying tons of moving metal. It was the perfect translation of the hidden truth we so often ignore. It is not size or strength that defines an act of heroism, but the willingness to act when everyone else is silent. Some passengers got up from their seats, attracted by the scene. Some laughed, thinking it was an exaggeration. Others, however, began to feel a lump in their stomach, that uncomfortable feeling that something was not right. The dog jumped, patted its paws on the bumper, and each bark sounded like a cry of urgency. He wasn't just getting in the way, he was trying to stop dozens of people from advancing into unseen danger. And this is where the suspense reaches its peak. Every passing second seemed to amplify the tension between moving forward or stopping, between ignoring or listening. The driver, annoyed, rehearsed a small snatch, advancing a few centimeters. It was enough for everyone to notice the desperate reaction of the dog, which ran from side to side, returning to the front as if trying to use its own body as a barrier. This moment of pure instinct brings deep reflection. How many times in our own journeys have we had to put ourselves in the path of something bigger than ourselves, knowing that we could be crushed, but still choosing to hold the position because we believed it was the right one? This is the essence of courage that transforms situations and changes destinies. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this image of a dog blocking the passage of a bus is much more than a curious scene. It's a portrait of mentality. Think of the symbolic force of this. When life puts before us a danger, we will not always have time to plan, calculate, or discuss. Sometimes the decision needs to be made right there on the spot, with a racing heart and instinct guiding every gesture. It is at this point that we reveal who we really are, because the mask of rationality falls, and what remains is the essence of our truth. The passengers, now divided, formed an involuntary audience. Some pressed for travel, others urged caution, but no one could take their eyes off the scene. The dog ran, came back, barked, blocked the front, and then positioned itself next to the door that still vibrated with failure. It was as if he was trying to show clearly where the danger was. This insistence began to break down the barriers of disbelief. Suddenly, what seemed like a nuisance began to sound like a warning. An older man sitting in the front even commented in a low voice, "This dog is not normal." No. And it was at that moment that the first spark of doubt spread. This detail is crucial. The transformation of a scene of rejection into a moment of revelation only happens when someone insists beyond the limit. If the dog had given up on the first barks, no one would have noticed. But their persistence, even in the face of hostility, is what made room for humans to begin to see the danger. How many times in life is this not the case too? The impact of our actions is not only in the first attempt but in the decision to continue, even when the world insists on not listening. From the outside, the dog seemed to be fighting against time. He wasn't aware of how many seconds were left, but he knew that every moment was precious. The pressure was mounting. The driver snorted, annoyed, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. The dog, however, did not retreat. He was gripped by something bigger than himself, an instinctual force that made him believe that giving up was not an option. This is the invisible hoop of courage. It is not about not feeling afraid, but about understanding that despite fear, stopping is not an alternative. And what this scene shows us deep down is how small decisions can change the course of an entire journey. An ordinary dog, in an ordinary terminal in the middle of a banal routine, turned that instant into a watershed. He did not calculate risks, did not think about consequences, just trusted what he felt. And that's the kind of decision that, in our lives, can be the difference between disaster and transformation. Meanwhile, passengers held their breath. Some already stood up to try to see better. Others commented in a low tone, and there were those who began to question the driver. Wait a bit. See what's happening. The mood of indifference dissipated, replaced by an atmosphere of suspense and attention. The dog had achieved what seemed impossible, capturing everyone's mind and heart, forcing them to look at what they didn't want to see. And maybe that's the biggest revelation of that scene. Because, just like that bus, how many times do we move on without realizing that there is something loose, a door that is poorly closed, a failure that can cost us dearly? And just like those passengers, how often do we need someone or something to step in front of us, forcing us to stop and rethink? The dog, with his heroic action, reminds us that the warning does not always come packaged in a soft form. Sometimes it comes in the form of shock, annoyance, scream. But this is exactly what saves. He said, "I'm on this journey too." Inside the bus, the atmosphere, which until a few moments was just a mixture of scattered conversations and everyday noises, began to transform. The driver, pressed by the impatience of the passengers and the routine that made him repeat those same gestures daily, did not realize the gravity of what was about to happen. To him, it was just another inconvenient dog disrupting the natural order of things. But from the outside, the scene reached a level of tension impossible to ignore. The dog, panting, with its eyes fixed on the vehicle and its incessant barking, did not retreat. He had become, in fact, the last barrier between tragedy and safety. The driver once again pressed the horn, hoping that the loud sound would be enough to drive the animal away. But instead of being intimidated, the dog reinforced his position. And it was in this contrast that something began to change inside the driver himself. The dog's steady gaze, the insistence on staying ahead of those gigantic wheels, provoked a doubt he didn't expect to feel. That hesitation, which seemed to last for seconds, was loaded with an enormous weight. It was as if consciousness began to slowly open up, forced not by words, but by an instinctive, non-negotiable gesture. Passengers, now alert, were also feeling the impact of the scene. What was once irritation gave way to curiosity. With every movement of the dog, a part of human indifference dissolved. One lady held her purse tightly, her eyes wide, as if she had finally understood that something was wrong. A man in a suit, until then distracted by his cell phone, raised his head and frowned, watching the bus door that was still shaking abnormally. The silence spread in a strange way, as if everyone began to realize at the same time that this was not just any situation. A teenager who had laughed minutes earlier now held her breath, while a mother with a small child pulled her closer, as if instinctively realizing there was danger in the air. It was a collective shift of energy, almost palpable. The dog, which seemed only a nuisance, was now seen with other eyes. The barking no longer sounded like noise, it sounded like a warning. The driver, already with his hand on the gear shift, hesitated. He looked at the passengers, then forward, and saw the dog again advance against the bumper. The emotional impact of that moment was definitive. He took a deep breath, released the shifter, and slammed on the brakes, holding the bus before it even moved forward. The sound of gears returning to neutral echoed inside the vehicle like a revelation. It was the decision that separated haste from disaster, and it was at that very moment that suspense turned to relief. The tension that had gripped the terminal began to dissolve into a wave of murmurs and deep breaths. Passengers looked at each other, some with expressions of amazement, others with tears held back by the adrenaline rush. They didn't know for sure what had just been prevented, but they knew intuitively that something terrible had been stopped. It was as if everyone had suddenly woken up to the importance of that dog, who alone had done what no one else could, prevent departure and save lives. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this collective transformation, from irritation to attention, from doubt to recognition, from fear to relief, reveals a lot about our own mindset. How many times in our journeys don't we need a shock of reality to finally stop and see? The dog, by insisting on his position, forced the surrounding humans to change their perception. He was the trigger that exposed the hidden truth that no one wanted to admit. There was danger, and it was necessary to act. And this is the essence of the great revelations. They do not always come smoothly. They do not always appear in polished speeches or detailed analysis. They often arise as sudden interruptions, as a cry that bothers, as an unexpected gesture that dismantles the logic we had built. The impact is precisely in this break in expectation, because only when something takes us off the usual route can we see clearly what was in front of us all the time. The silence that spread inside the bus was not just absence of sound. It was a silence charged with consciousness, as if everyone were at the same time reflecting on what had just happened. The irritation that had dominated a few minutes earlier completely disappeared, giving way to a sense of respect and even gratitude. One lady muttered, He knew. This dog knew something. These words, spoken in an almost reverent tone, echoed as a summary of the collective feeling. The driver, still with his hand firmly on the wheel, felt his heart racing. Maybe it was human instinct, maybe it was conscience awakening, but he knew that that brake had not been in vain. If it had gone ahead, something terrible could have happened. This perception caused his expression to change, from irritation to respect. He no longer saw the dog as a nuisance, but as someone who, in some mysterious way, had prevented him from making an irreversible mistake. And here's the big lesson. We don't need definitive proof to recognize when something isn't right. Sometimes it is enough to pay attention to the insistence of signs, no matter how annoying they are. The dog was this tireless voice that did not allow the mistake to materialize. How many times in our lives do we also need someone, or something, to put the brakes on our decisions before it's too late? This is the living metaphor of this scene. The importance of having the courage not only to act, but also to interrupt. Outside, the dog still couldn't stop barking. His body vibrated with energy, as if he wanted to make sure everyone had understood the message. It was like saying, "It's not over yet, look right, something's not right." The whole terminal seemed to breathe differently after that moment. The sound of the engine turning off, the murmurs that spread, the stares at the dog. It was as if they had all been witnesses to a revelation. A kind of hidden truth that came out strongly. And it's amazing how in a matter of seconds, what could have been a tragedy turned into a moment of collective learning. The dog, not understanding the weight of his action, had taught something profound, that life always gives signs, and that listening to these signs can save not only ourselves but everyone around us. This experience, which began with impatience and almost ended in disaster, had turned into a lesson in mentality, in attentiveness, in courage. Gradually, the passengers' breathing was returning to normal rhythm, but the emotional impact was still there. It was as if each person now carried a new perception, a new way of looking at details that had previously gone unnoticed. The dog had changed not only the course of that moment, but also the way everyone there would interpret their own warning signs from here on out. He said, "That makes sense to me." The driver remained motionless, his hand still resting on the steering wheel, while the passengers looked at each other with expressions of amazement and relief. The dog, panting, stood firmly in front of the bus as if he knew that his role was not over yet. The heavy silence was broken by one of the passengers who, with a trembling voice, suggested that someone check the vehicle before proceeding. The comment, though simple, echoed like a spark of collective consciousness. The collector, still hesitant, got off first, followed by some more curious passengers. The dog accompanied them with a watchful eye, and with each step towards the poorly fitted door, his barking subsided, as if to say, "Now you will understand." A terminal employee, noticing the crowding, approached. It soon caught the attention of a mechanic working nearby. The specialist, accustomed to the backstage of public transport vehicles, calmly approached, but as soon as he observed the side door, his countenance changed. He bent down, examined the fitting, touched the mechanism that was still vibrating irregularly, and after a few seconds of analysis, he let out a short sentence that made everyone hold their breath. "This here could not have run like this." The weight of those words fell on everyone present as a revelation. Suddenly, what seemed only a nuisance provoked by a noisy dog took on outlines of real gravity. The authority of the mechanic's voice brought out the hidden truth. There was, in fact, a serious flaw. If the vehicle had continued traveling, the door could have opened on the move, throwing passengers out or fatally trapping someone. The risk was not small, it was huge. The passengers looked at each other, shocked. Some put their hands to their mouths in amazement. A mother hugged her son tighter, seized by the idea that minutes before, he could have been a victim of that failure. The driver silently averted his eyes, aware that the rush had almost cost him dearly. The dog, in turn, remained motionless, as if waiting for confirmation that only humans could give. And she came with all the lyrics, by the voice of an expert who left no room for doubt. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the impact of the discovery is not only in the danger itself, but in the way we deal with the revelations in our lives. Often we need someone with authority, with experience to confirm what was already before us, but which we insisted on ignoring. It is as if truth only becomes acceptable when recognized by an outside voice, when it bears the stamp of one who knows what he is talking about. But in reality, this truth has screamed before. We just choose not to listen. This is a pattern that repeats itself in different journeys. How many times do we only believe in something when a doctor, a teacher, a leader, or an expert confirms what our body, our intuition, or even a close friend had already signaled? What happened on that terminal is the perfect metaphor for that mentality. The dog had already revealed the danger, but it took the word of a mechanic for everyone to accept the seriousness of the situation. And this makes us reflect. Why do we so often rely more on external authority than on the clear signs before our eyes? As the mechanic continued to inspect the door, more people approached. Some passengers got off the bus, still in shock, commenting on how they were seconds away from disaster. There was a mixture of fear and gratitude in the air. The terminal employee asked for reinforcement, and soon another technician approached, confirming the diagnosis. This failure could have caused a serious accident. The bus needs to be picked up immediately. The words, charged with firmness, transformed everyone's perception. There was no more room for doubt. The driver, who until then had been annoyed by the dog's insistence, lowered his head in silence. He knew that his haste, his blind reliance on routine, had almost put dozens of people at risk. That break, brought on by a dog that wouldn't shut up, had made all the difference. The relief among the passengers was visible, but there was also a discomfort, the awareness that they ignored the alert until the last moment. This discomfort is powerful because it forces us to rethink our own decisions. How many times do we move on, relying only on the appearance of normalcy, until an expert reveals to us that we were on the verge of disaster? How many times do we only change our attitude when someone with more experience confirms what we should have already realized on our own? This reliance on external validation is behind the scenes of our collective mindset, and recognizing this is the first step to true transformation. The presence of the dog, silent now that its mission seemed accomplished, made the scene all the more symbolic. He needed no medals, no clapping, no words. His watchful eye and firm posture already said it all. It was as if he had done what needed to be done, and now let the humans assimilate the revelation. The impact of his attitude was amplified by the confirmation of the mechanics, who left no doubt about the risk that had been avoided. And perhaps the most striking thing was to realize how an instant of animal stubbornness managed to expose such deep human frailties. The dog followed instinct. Humans needed reports and experts. But in the end, everyone came to the same conclusion. If he had not prevented the departure, the consequences would have been devastating. This naked truth carried a transformative weight. The terminal, which minutes before was only a space of haste and routine, was now taken over by an atmosphere of reflection. Passengers talked to each other, still nervous. Some stroked the dog as a sign of gratitude, as if they wanted to recognize the key role it had played. Others, in silence, just stared at the bus, trying to imagine what could have happened. The truth was there, gaping. The disaster only didn't happen because someone, a dog, not a human, refused to accept apparent normalcy. And this detail is crucial, because on our journey we also come across poorly fitted doors, loose gears, invisible flaws that we insist on ignoring. And just like those passengers, we often need a reality check to understand that we weren't as safe as we thought. The recognition of the experts was the final confirmation, but the lesson had already been given much earlier. We need to learn to listen to the signals, even if they come from unexpected places. He says, "I'm on this journey too." The minutes that followed the discovery of the fault were marked by a profound change in the atmosphere of the terminal. The bus, which until then symbolized haste and routine, now stood still, surrounded by looks that mixed disbelief and gratitude. The driver was still taking a deep breath, trying to process the extent of what had been avoided. The passengers talked among themselves, some in a trembling voice, others still in shock, recognizing that they had been on the verge of a tragedy. But in the center of that scene, the real protagonist remained there, the dog, panting, attentive, with eyes shining like someone who knows he has fulfilled his role. He did not understand the scale of the impact of his actions. He did not understand that he had just saved dozens of lives, but everyone around now knew. That animal, which minutes before had been treated as a nuisance, had become the symbol of courage and loyalty. The collector was the first to approach carefully, extending his hand as if to apologize for the initial indifference. The dog watched him, took a deep breath, and allowed the gesture. It was as if he accepted that silent recognition, with no need for applause or words. Soon other passengers approached. A lady stroked her head with tears in her eyes, thanking her softly. A child, once frightened by barking, now hugged him tightly, as if he had found in the dog an invisible guardian. The buzz spread through the terminal. "He saved everyone as if it weren't for this dog." The phrases echoed as collective confirmation of the heroism that had just been witnessed. And here is a curious detail. Genuine courage does not need a stage. It does not need rehearsed speeches. It manifests itself in acts that in themselves carry the truth and impact necessary to touch people. The dog did not seek recognition, but the community, sensitized, felt the need to express respect. It was as if everyone wanted to somehow return in gratitude what he had given in bravery. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this moment of recognition shows us something essential about the human mentality. We often spend our lives seeking validation, yearning for applause and approval. But real transformation happens when we understand that real impact doesn't depend on the audience, but on the courage to act when no one else moves. The dog did not expect praise, did not act to be celebrated. He just followed instinct, which is precisely why his gesture became so grandiose. However, the recognition that came from the community has enormous symbolic value, because he exalts not only the dog itself, but what it represents: loyalty, protective instinct, attention to invisible signs. The applause was not for the animal as an individual, but for the archetype it embodied. Each gesture of affection, each word of thanks, was also a reflection of the human desire to connect to something greater, to recognize that heroes are not measured by strength or size, but by the willingness to put their lives on the line for others. The driver, still visibly shaken, got off the bus and silently approached the dog. There was a mixture of shame and respect in his eyes. He knew that he had been saved from a thoughtless decision, and that if he had ignored the animal, the burden of tragedy would have fallen on his hands. Without words, he just leaned over and made a simple gesture. He ran his hand over the dog's head. To those who looked, it was just a touch. But in that instant, it was also a public, almost solemn recognition that the real driver of that story was not the man behind the wheel, but the dog that stood between haste and disaster. And the scene didn't stop there. People started filming, commenting, sharing their insights. It wasn't just a local story. It was an event that carried with it the force of something universal. Because on some level, everyone saw themselves reflected in that moment. The mistake that almost happened, the warning that was ignored, the salvation that came from where it was least expected. The dog was not only the hero of a bus terminal. He was the hero of everyone who ever needed someone to stop them from heading towards the abyss. The recognition of the community was growing. The terminal employee made sure to officially record what happened, mentioning the importance of the animal's intervention. One mechanic commented to passengers that in his entire career he had rarely seen such a serious failure noticed in time. The words of the experts gave even more weight to the dog's act. There was no way to relativize. He had really prevented a tragedy. And that kind of validation, coming from authorities and from witnesses, has a powerful effect. Because it not only reinforces the truth of what happened, but also transforms the moment into collective memory. Every person who was there would carry with them the living memory of the dog that saved the bus. And that memory, like all the stories that mark it, would spread, inspiring other people, elsewhere, to pay more attention to the invisible signs we insist on ignoring. The community, touched, began to look at the dog not only as a hero, but as a symbol. And this leads us to reflect on how certain gestures have the ability to break through the barrier of the immediate and become eternal. The silent courage of that animal was not restricted to that day, that space. She went on to integrate the journey of everyone who witnessed, leaving invisible marks on her future decisions. And perhaps this is the greatest impact of an act of heroism, not only saving lives in that instant, but also transforming mindsets forever. Every time those passengers get on a bus, every time the driver adjusts the mirrors, every time someone hears an insistent bark, everyone will remember. Because the memory will be connected not only with the avoided danger, but with the hero who dared to interrupt the inevitable. And it shows us that heroes are not shaped by expectation, but by action. They are not only recognized for what they do, but for what they awaken in people. The dog aroused respect, aroused attention, awakened a conscience that was asleep. And this awakening is more valuable than any medal because it represents a lasting transformation. He says, "I'm on this journey too." The impact of what had happened was not restricted to the bus terminal alone. The scene spread like a silent wave that gained strength with each report, with each witness who put into words what he had witnessed. The passengers, still under the effect of adrenaline, talked among themselves as if trying to confirm to each other that it was not a dream or an illusion. Every detail was recounted with intensity, as if the dog's act needed to be recorded in multiple versions so as not to risk getting lost in the collective memory. And it is precisely at this point that history began to transform into something greater than a simple event. It became a milestone of transformation for all who were present. One young woman, her voice still muffled, said to the group next to her, "I swear I thought he was just getting in the way. But if it wasn't for this dog, maybe we wouldn't be here talking right now." These words, simple and emotionally charged, summed up the radical change that had taken place in everyone's perception. Annoyance had given way to gratitude, and the noise of barking now echoed like a warning sound that prevented tragedy. Another passenger, a middle-aged man, added, "He was the one who saw what we didn't see. It was he who felt before all of us." And this recognition was repeated in different tones, in different voices, but always with the same essence, the certainty that that animal had unwittingly become the invisible link between danger and salvation. And the most curious thing is that the impact did not stop on passengers. Surrounding neighbors, attracted by the commotion, approached to understand what was happening. When they discovered that a dog had stopped a bus about to leave, and that soon after a serious failure in the vehicle was confirmed, the reaction was of astonishment. Some put their hands to their mouths, shocked. Others stared at the dog, as if trying to decipher the greatness of his intuition. And there were also those who, moved, saw in the scene a living metaphor, the hidden truth that often those who seem insignificant can carry in themselves the courage that changes destinies. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this collective reaction shows us something fascinating about human nature. When an act of heroism happens before us, it becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the action itself but what we carry inside. Passengers and neighbors, in recognizing the dog as a hero, were also recognizing their own limitations, their distractions, their failures to realize the obvious. It was as if in exalting the dog they admitted, "We did not see, we did not feel, but he did." And this recognition does not diminish the humans present, on the contrary, it transforms them. Because accepting that someone, or in this case an animal, was able to see the danger before them, is also accepting that we need to be more attentive to the signs, that we need to learn to listen to the alerts that life sends us. The testimonies multiplied. One mother with the child in her lap thanked him aloud. "He saved my son's life. I'll never forget that." The weight of that sentence was almost palpable. It was no longer an abstraction. It was the realization that a different destiny had been written there, in that instant, because a dog had the courage to face horns, screams, and impatient looks to protect lives that were not his. A young man who filmed the scene with his cell phone commented, "This video needs to be seen by everyone. This isn't just about a dog. It's about how we need to learn to respect what we often despise." The public at that time was no longer just made up of witnesses. It was made up of messengers who would spread the revelation. The curious thing is that, in the midst of all these lines, a collective perception began to emerge. The heroism of the dog was not only in the act itself, but in the human impact it provoked. People who would never have exchanged a word with each other were now united by the same feeling. Passengers looked each other in the eyes, shared hugs, expressed gratitude as if they were old acquaintances. That moment had disarmed the invisible barriers that, in everyday life, separate individuals into bubbles of haste and indifference. The dog, by stopping the bus, not only saved physical lives, he also broke through apathy, awakening a new mentality in the collective. And this is precisely what makes the scene even more powerful, the fact that an isolated gesture has the power to trigger chain transformations. The driver, who had initially been annoyed by the animal, now spoke in an embarrassed voice to some neighbors. "If I had left, I don't know what would be happening now. Not only did he stop the bus, he made me stop too." This confession, coming from the one who had the greatest responsibility in that situation, carried a hidden truth that few would admit with such sincerity. Too often we are saved not only from external dangers, but from our own thoughtless decisions. Gradually, the story was gaining contours of collective revelation. People commented on how the dog's instinct was a living metaphor for those times when we ignore the signs of life. "How often do we keep going even though we know something is wrong?" said one passenger when interviewed. Today it was a dog that prevented the tragedy. But in our lives, how many times do alerts appear that we insist on not listening to? This reflection, born of the heat of emotion, became all the more valuable because it was not in a book or in an elaborate speech. It was in a human account, direct, born of real experience. And here's another essential point: the human impact of heroism goes far beyond the instant it happens. It reverberates, turns into learning, becomes stories that shape mentalities. The dog had become more than a savior that day. He had become a symbol, an example, an inspiration. What people witnessed and reported would not be lost in the quick forgetting of any routine. On the contrary, this episode would take root, growing in the collective memory, influencing future decisions, changing looks, awakening consciences. The terminal, which had previously been just a scene of haste and impatience, was now charged with a different aura. The conversations were no longer superficial, but deep reflections. People talked about instinct, about courage, about the value of life. And all this because a dog, not understanding the weight of his actions, decided to act. The truth is that in every story, in every tear, in every smile of relief, there was a piece of the transformation that had begun there. It wasn't just a story to be told, it was an experience to be remembered. And perhaps that is precisely the great revelation. Heroism, when it is genuine, creates connections that cross barriers and unite strangers on the same journey. The dog did not speak, did not explain, did not ask for anything. But with his attitude, he managed to unite different hearts in the same understanding. Life is fragile and every decision matters. This is the most profound human impact, not only to have prevented the tragedy, but to have awakened a new mindset in everyone who witnessed it. He said, "That makes sense to me." The silence that hung after all the commotion seemed to carry a different weight. It was not just the absence of noise, but a kind of collective reverence for what had just happened. The dog, still panting, remained alert, as if he were still watching something invisible to human eyes. And perhaps that was exactly what fascinated everyone. The realization that there was a purer instinct, a more alert look, capable of identifying dangers that people's haste and distraction had ignored. Little by little, the initial tension gave way to an atmosphere of reflection, as if each one began to resignify their own experience before the scene. People spoke quietly, as if they did not want to break that moment that had already become a memory. A few discreet tears flowed, not only for the relief of being alive, but for the realization that they had been protected by someone who asked for nothing in return. One animal, with its instinctive courage, had become the invisible shield of dozens of lives. And it is curious how in moments like this, the human mind opens up to something greater. It was no longer just a specific episode. It was as if everyone were facing a revelation about the very nature of life, about the fragility of moments, and about the power of choices, even those made by those who, in theory, do not choose, but act out of love and loyalty. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what this dog did is not just an isolated act of bravery. He shows us how perception can be a true beacon in moments of darkness. Dogs, at their core, carry a sensitivity that often surpasses human understanding. They feel smells that we do not perceive, react to sounds that we ignore. But more than that, they capture energies, subtleties, changes in the environment that escape our vision. And this episode is living proof of how this insight can literally save lives. If we think about it, how many times do we ignore signals because we think we know more than what seems obvious? The human mentality, accustomed to logic, to the repeated patterns of routine, tends to despise what escapes the usual. The dog, however, does not have this limitation. He acts when he feels. He puts himself at risk, not because he has reflected on statistics, but because something inside him says it is necessary. And this disposition, so pure and direct, forces us to reflect on our own decisions. How often do we fail to act because we think too much, because we doubt the signs, because we give more weight to appearances than to invisible evidence? The quiet heroism of these animals reveals a hidden truth about ourselves. We may be much better able to perceive the dangers around us, but we choose not to listen. The dog in that terminal left no room for hesitation. He did not expect applause, did not ask permission, just acted. And it is exactly this instinctive courage that inspires us. With every look the passengers cast at him, there was a mixture of gratitude and shame. Gratitude that they were alive, shame that they weren't the ones to notice what was wrong first. And here is the point that excites. Dogs teach us day after day that true strength lies not in excessive rationality, but in the ability to love without measure and to protect without conditions. They do not need speeches about responsibility. They do not need to be reminded that life is valuable. They just feel and act. This purity, which we so often despise as simplicity, is actually the essence of transformation. Because if we were willing to listen more carefully to the signs, as this dog listened, maybe our decisions would be different. Maybe we would avoid tragedies not only in traffic, but also in our own personal journeys. The emotional impact of witnessing something like this is profound. A lady who had almost lost her balance in the confusion said to those next to her, "He didn't just save us. He saved my faith in good things." This phrase echoed as a synthesis of collective feeling. It wasn't just about escaping an accident. It was about being reminded that there are forces, even the most unexpected, willing to put themselves between us and danger. The dog, having never read about courage or selflessness, had become a silent hero. And when we talk about silent heroes, we are not limited to animals. This expression symbolizes all those who act behind the scenes without immediate recognition, but who somehow support the lives of others. It is the firefighter who enters the fire. It is the doctor who insists on a difficult surgery. It is the mother who loses nights of sleep. It is the friend who warns when no one else dares to tell the truth. The dog only reminds us that these heroes can take the most unlikely forms, including the four-legged one, with attentive eyes and heart beating in rhythm with unconditional love. Now imagine the impact of carrying that lesson into life. The dog didn't just interrupt a disaster. He offered us a mirror. It showed us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act even in front of it. It showed us that attention is not paranoia, but sensitivity to details that can make a difference. It showed us that unconditional love is not a pretty word in books, but a practical force capable of changing destinies. This is the true transformation that begins within each person who witnessed that act. And it is at this point that reflection gains even more strength. Because if we're honest, how many times in our own stories do we ignore the clear signs that something wasn't right? How many times have we insisted on paths that smelled of danger just because haste or vanity blinded us? The dog, in his loyalty, gave us an almost painful reminder. One must stop, look, feel, before moving forward. And above all, it takes courage to face discomfort, even if it means putting yourself in front of something much bigger than us. The most fascinating thing is that even after all the commotion, the dog did not seem to seek recognition. There was no pride in him. There was no vanity in him. He remained attentive, as if his mission had not yet ended. And perhaps it is this posture that excites us the most. The fact that while we seek explanations, he simply remains faithful to the instinct to protect. This constancy is the essence of unconditional love. The passengers, the neighbors, everyone who witnessed it, now carried not only the memory of an act of bravery, but an internal call to change their mindset. It was as if the episode had opened a door, revealing that courage can manifest in the most unexpected places, and that we don't have to wait for big speeches to learn about mindfulness, transformation, and loyalty. The hidden truth is that the greatest teachers often don't use words. And at this point, the inevitable question arises, can we take this learning beyond that specific moment? Because the beauty of a revelation is in how it reverberates, in how it impacts future decisions, in how it silently shapes us. That dog's courage doesn't have to be tied to the terminal. It can become inspiration for each of us as we face our own moving buses, our own unseen dangers. He said, "I'm on this journey too." At that moment when the emotional dust began to settle, all eyes still turned to the dog. He stood there steadfast, not fully understanding the size of the feat, but radiating something that transcended words. The terminal, which minutes earlier was just a common space, now carried a different, almost sacred atmosphere. There was a collective sense that something extraordinary had happened, and that each person present had been transformed from within. It was not just the memory of an accident averted, but the clear realization that life had given an unexpected demonstration of courage, instinct, and unconditional love. That's the power of little heroes. They don't come with covers, they don't need speeches or spotlights. They arise at the most unlikely times, disrupt the flow of normalcy, and remind us that there are invisible forces shaping our journeys. The dog not only prevented a tragedy, he showed that true greatness is often hidden in the simplest attitudes, in the insistence not to give up, in the act of staying even when everyone else has already lost patience or sensitivity. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what this story reveals to us goes beyond the narrative of an animal that put itself in front of a bus. It invites us to reflect on how we see the signs of life, and how we interpret the backstage of everyday life. How often do we ignore something that seems small, but deep down has a gigantic impact? The transformation of the community at that terminal was immediate. Haste gave way to contemplation, irritation dissolved into respect, and each passenger left carrying an intimate revelation. And this is the most fascinating part. The change did not happen because someone spoke, but because a silent gesture broke through the barrier of indifference. It shows us that decisions can change destinies, that paying attention to detail can prevent disasters, and that the hidden truth is not always in the big announcements, but in the firm gaze of those who insist on warning us. The dog has become, without realizing it, the link between danger and salvation, between ignorance and conscience, between tragedy and hope. The impact of that scene didn't stick that day. The journey of passengers has transformed. Many carried the account to their families, neighbors, co-workers. The story spread not as gossip, but as testimony. And every time it was told, it rekindled the reflection. What if he wasn't there? What if we had ignored it to the end? This question was not just about that moment, but about life as a whole. How often do we move forward without listening to the warnings that surround us? How many times have we moved forward without breaking, even when everything around us seems to scream for us to stop? This dog proved that even the smallest heroes can prevent great tragedies. And this is more than a beautiful phrase. It's a lesson that echoes in our daily choices. The hero in this case did not have a human voice, did not have titles or diplomas, did not have positions or positions of authority, but he had something that many lose over time: the courage to act when it is necessary. This courage, born of loyalty and unconditional love, is capable of moving mountains, of transforming environments, of saving lives. And here's the truth we can't ignore. We all carry, on some level, that same possibility of being silent heroes. Maybe not in front of a moving bus, but in front of the decisions we make, in front of the people we choose to support, in front of the situations in which we need to position ourselves. The great revelation is that we don't have to wait for epic moments to manifest our courage. It reveals itself in the small gestures, in the redoubled attention, in the willingness to interrupt a dangerous cycle before it becomes irreversible. That dog, by barking and putting himself at risk, not only saved lives, he reminded us that behind the daily rush, there is a constant call to be more attentive, more aware, and more willing to act. And when we think about the impact of this, we realize that the transformation it has generated goes far beyond the terminal. It is a message to all who listen to this story. Never underestimate the power of small acts. Never ignore the signs. Never despise the silent backstage where true courage reveals itself. Now, the emotion of this episode needs to be carried forward, because if this scene moved you, it is a sign that she brought up something that was saved. Maybe it's a reminder to pay more attention. Maybe it's a call to trust instinct more. Maybe it's the revelation that even in the most ordinary situations, there can be great hidden lessons. This dog showed by his insistence that life is fragile, but it is also protected by unexpected forces. And that, in the end, courage, an awakened mindset, and loyalty can change everything. If this story moved you, leave your like, share it with someone who loves dogs, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories of animal heroism. And look, if you have come this far with me, you have already realized how much a simple story can carry so much transformation and so much learning about courage, attention, and even about the choices we make in life. If this content made sense to you, if it brought you value in any way, enjoy and subscribe to the channel, and because it is precisely this kind of reflection and inspiration that I want to continue sharing with you here. Oh, and tell me in the comments that you stayed until the end. He says, "I will be with you until the end." It's going to be our way of marking that special connection that we've created throughout this video. And of course, leave your like too, not as an obligation, but as that sign that the message has really touched you. Now, it doesn't stop there. There is a video here on the side that complements this topic and will expand this conversation even more. Click and continue with me there, because I am sure you will enjoy the continuation of this journey